Well, welcome to Community Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm Sarah Reiling, one of the worship associates and part of the team that works to bring the worship services to you. We're glad that you're with us today. Whether you're a member or a new visitor, we welcome you. Whether you're here in the sanctuary with us or are watching online, may you find connection with us and nourishment for your mind and your spirit. We welcome all of who you are and all you dream of becoming. If you would like to share something that is on your heart today, there's a book at the back between the two cabinets in which you may write your joy or concern. Later in the service, we will read from the book. In this way, your joys and your concerns will become part of this service and part of the prayers and awareness of this congregation. We welcome to our pulpit today Tanner Trask. Tanner lives in Saginaw, Texas with his wife and dog. They have been members of Westside UU in Fort Worth since 2009, after discovering Unitarian Universalism in 2008. Tanner is currently a student at Meadville-Lombard UU Seminary, working on his Master's of Divinity with an eye towards UU ministry. Please welcome Tanner Trask.
Good morning. Good morning. Our call to worship is a protest and a party by the Reverend Hannah Roberts Villnave. People sometimes ask, is pride a protest or a party? And the answer is, of course, yes. And why not? Why not rejoice as we resist, dance as we demand change, celebrate as we create community that delights in all of who we are? So bring all of that with you this morning. Bring your policy demands, bring your glitter, bring your Supreme Court broken heart, bring your rainbow socks, bring the emptiness you feel for our siblings gone too soon. Bring your Gloria Estefan remix, bring your tender hope for change, bring your most garish eyeshadow, bring your spirit tattered and battered by a world that seems insistent on choosing fear and hate. Gather up all of these things and bring them here, to a place where we don't have to shoulder these burdens or celebrate these joys alone. Come, let us worship together.
Our message for all ages is Mouse and Crow by Kelly Weisman, Asprooth-Jackson. There was once a crow who was very hungry. Flying over the tops of the trees, it spotted a large, tasty-looking walnut growing from one of the tallest branches below. Seeing the makings of a fine supper, the crow swooped down and plucked the dangling walnut and held it triumphantly in its beak. The crow flapped its wings happily and began to think about how best to break open the shell of the walnut. Meanwhile, on the ground below, an equally hungry mouse saw everything that had happened and decided it wanted some of that walnut for itself. With a plan that was clever, though not very nice, the mouse called up to the crow high in the tree. "Say there, friend crow, what's that you have in your beak?" The crow, who was hungry enough by now that it wasn't thinking all of its decisions through very well, called back, "I found a nice fat walnut, and I'm going to eat it." When the crow opened its mouth to say all that, the walnut fell out of it and dropped to the ground, just as the mouse had hoped it would. But the mouse didn't count on where the walnut would land when it fell. It hit the ground and rolled into a shallow hole. The mouse ran to the hole and reached in to pull out the walnut so it could crack the shell and eat it. But the hole was just small enough that the mouse could not pull it out. With both its paws wrapped around, the walnut was too wide to get back up out of the hole. The crow, meanwhile, was unhappy at having been tricked out of its supper and began to shout at the mouse down below, who couldn't leave because it was still holding on to the walnut, trying and failing to pull it out of the hole in the ground. Now, if the two of them had worked together, they both might have gotten to enjoy some of that walnut. The crow could have pecked its sharp beak down into the hole and broken up the walnut into smaller pieces. Then the mouse could have reached in and picked each piece out one at a time, but instead the two of them were stuck there, arguing with each other, both still hungry, the mouse because it wouldn't let go, and the crow because it couldn't hold on.
Our reading today is from the 2 Corinthians book of the Bible, chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. This is Paul speaking. To keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan sent to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong." Good morning again. Great to see all of you here today. Thank you so much for inviting me into your wonderful sanctuary and up to the pulpit. For those of you that haven't met me or haven't sort of seen me around at other UU things here in North Texas, I'm Tanner Trask. My pronouns are he, him. And like Sarah mentioned at the start, been a member of my wife and I and my dog. Dog's name is Tizzy. She's a Great Dane Weimaraner mix for those of you that needed that information. Yeah, my wife's name is Melissa. But so we've been involved sort of in Unitarian Universalism since 2008. I grew up in Wisconsin, where I went to the First Congregational Church of Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, kind of a pretty laid-back Midwestern Protestantism, which isn't exactly the Protestantism I encountered when I came down to Texas. So we were very glad to find Unitarian Universalism in 2008, joined the church in 2009, and now I'm in seminary hoping to, sometime in the next few years, become a UU minister. So that's kind of how that went. I do still have a few years left to go, but so far it's already been an interesting journey. So if this is your first time at a UU church, first of all, welcome. You may have noticed already that we do things a little differently here. The reflection or the sermon may or may not touch on aspects of the divine or any particular holy book. We do draw from many sources in Unitarian Universalism, but historically, our denomination ties closest back with American Protestant Christianity, kind of like my history, and maybe some of yours. We don't have a creed here. Sarah mentioned that earlier. I just wanted to go into a tiny bit more detail for anyone that doesn't quite sure about what that meant. It means we don't require any specific religious or theological belief for you to be welcome here. Some of us, or even a member here, some of us probably describe ourselves as theists, those that believe in God or a God or some higher power in general. There's obviously atheists, which do not believe in any of those things. And some of us would describe ourselves maybe as agnostics or humanists or sort of spiritual, but maybe not religious. I'm sure we have all of those in here today, and those possibilities are endless, and we do welcome all of the above in this church. And sort of all of that to say this, that if you were to come back on another Sunday, and I do hope that you do, I hope you find something here that brings you back on another Sunday, it's entirely possible the sermon or the reflection will not be about the Bible. However, today's is. I do want to make sure I'm setting expectations properly. So today I will be talking about the Bible, specifically the, let's say, controversial Apostle Paul. I'll discuss some of the harm that Paul's writings have done, especially here in June, Pride Month, but also how we might be able to use them today as Unitarian Universalists to help work toward our beloved community. So we need to start somewhere, so why don't we start at the beginning? When God began to create the heavens and the... well, that might be too far back. Hold on. Okay. That's Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 from the Christian Bible. A lot of you may recognize that. It's right before God says, "Let there be light." Which again, a lot of you may recognize, but some of you might not. Even though Christianity is the most common religion here in the United States, it's not the official religion of the country. Does anybody know the official religion of the United States?
There isn't one.
There isn't one. Thank you. I used to be a U.S. history teacher. So, forgive me. Had to give that a try. Okay. But yeah, no official religion in U.S. history. Obviously, there are a lot of folks out there today that would like to change that. I think it's probably best if we don't have an official one. So there may be some of you today that aren't sort of familiar with even the basics of the story I'm going to talk about. So I do want to do a quick bit of background. The Bible is the holy book of Christianity, a religion that takes its name from Jesus Christ. This book was written by many different authors over hundreds of years, with some small part of it actually written during the time of Jesus while he was still alive. But most of it was written either decades or centuries afterward by people who weren't there during Jesus' lifetime. The New Testament of the Bible, the part that includes the Gospels of Jesus' ministry and what comes after, builds off of the Hebrew Bible, but does not, very importantly, does not replace the Hebrew Bible. Jesus was a Jewish rabbi or a teacher in the Jewish world under the control of the Roman Empire. He taught a revolutionary message that all were welcome in the kingdom of God, and that loving others as you yourself are loved is the greatest good of all. He was, of course, killed for threatening those power structures, both those of Rome itself as well as those of other Jewish factions that were in power at the time, namely among those the Pharisees. If you've heard of them from other Bible readings in your history, they were just another group of Jewish people that didn't really work well with the group of Jewish people that Jesus was leading. Now, during Jesus' lifetime, one Pharisee named Paul oppressed the early members of the Jesus movement. And after Jesus' death, the resurrected Christ appeared to Paul in a vision, and Paul became a follower of Jesus. There's a few versions of that story in the Bible. Like I said, it was written over decades and centuries, sort of after a lot of this happened. In the book of Acts, Paul is said to have traveled to meet the sort of former apostles of Jesus, your Marks, your Lukes, Johns, and such, the people who knew Jesus in his life. Now, in Paul's own writings, he doesn't make any mention of going to meet or hang out with these other apostles, so take that how you will. Now, what was important to Paul was spreading the word of God and Jesus to non-Jewish people, Gentiles in the terminology. Now, this was his mission, and Paul took it seriously. He traveled using his own money. He was a skilled stone worker, which is how he afforded being able to travel around with his own money. And he built many communities and churches of Jesus followers throughout sort of Greece and other parts of the Mediterranean. He was eventually planning on going to Spain, but he sort of died before that happened. So that never quite got to Spain. But Greece, Mediterranean, nice part of the world. Now, as I mentioned earlier, he is a controversial figure in the Bible for a few reasons. Now, his words make up about 13 books of the New Testament out of 27 total books. Now, I know I'm not addressing an audience of biblical scholars. If there are any biblical scholars in here, welcome. But you don't have to be. So I will keep this part brief. All it is important to know is that when we talk about Paul, there are some books in the Bible that have Paul's name on them, where most biblical scholars agree, yeah, this guy probably wrote these. A lot of good evidence for that. There's a few of these books where it's kind of like, maybe he wrote them, maybe he didn't. Scholars kind of go back and forth on them. And there is a collection of books where most biblical scholars will agree were written by someone else and put Paul's name on it for any number of reasons, including an appeal to authority. But that Paul didn't actually write them, which isn't really a defense or an apology of Paul. It doesn't really matter, honestly, if he wrote the words that have been used to harm a lot of people over the years, including potentially some in this very room. Now, in Unitarian Universalism, we have a sort of selection of, not a selection, would be a way to put it, a thing you can attain that you're a welcoming congregation. And that means that welcoming congregations in UU congregations take special care to make sure that we are a queer affirming church. Not a queer tolerating church, but a queer affirming church that actively affirms all members of the LGBTQ plus community. If you're not sure of the difference between affirming and tolerating, imagine somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I tolerate you. Not as good, right? It doesn't quite feel as good as I recognize you, I see you, I affirm you. It's not that you can be here, I guess. It's that you are welcome here, all of you. So, important part about you churches, I think. So I'm not going to repeat the actual verses from books that are attributed to Paul that have been used to label people as sinful based on who they love. I don't think we need to really get into those words, but I do want to recognize A, that they exist, and B, that they have done and continue to do harm. So when we talk about the other things that Paul did that I think might be useful to us, there are a lot of things that he did and said or have been attributed to him, but really doesn't matter, that we really need to be able to leave in the past and leave behind, recognize the harm and put it aside. Now, to put Paul's writings into a little bit of context, most of the time he was writing to a specific community about a particular event or trouble that community was having. He strongly believed that Jesus would return in his lifetime, which didn't happen, but he believed it, and he wanted to prepare as many people for his resurrection as he could. Now, part of that was wanting to make sure that people's souls were in a pure and holy state to be ready for the returning of Christ and the kingdom of heaven. One way that Paul thought that you needed to sort of keep your soul in a pure and holy state was to abstain from sex entirely, of any kind, not just like same-sex experiences, right? Now, if someone couldn't resist the pull to sin, then Paul's advice was, okay, go ahead and get married first if you have to. But Paul very, very much would prefer if you just didn't. Just don't. Now, there are some interesting asexual readings of Paul as a writer and as an apostle. That's kind of beyond what we're talking about today, but those are out there if that's something you're interested in looking into. So back to actual Paul and his time and the letter today. The Greek city of Corinth was near and dear to Paul's heart. 2 of those 27 books of the New Testament in the Bible are made up of letters from Paul to that community of non-Jewish Christians in Corinth. That actually Paul founded that community there. And those books are called the 1st and 2nd Corinthians books. Respectively. We're going to focus on 2 Corinthians. And now there's probably much more correspondence between Paul and this community over the years, but that's really all we have left. It's all that has really survived to this day. So that's what we have, and that's what we can sort of make use of. And we just need to keep in mind the context of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Paul is writing this letter to a specific audience. He was not writing a book of holy rules to be followed 2,000 years later. He didn't think there was going to be 2,000 more years. Remember, he thought Christ was returning in his lifetime. I think the thing he'd be most surprised about if we were to be able to talk to him today is that there were 2,000 more years. So that's not what he was doing. He wasn't sitting there writing, here's what everybody should be doing for the next 2,000 years. And this kind of reminds me a little bit of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his book Meditations. And that's a printing of Marcus's private journal that he kept while being emperor of Rome. And he expected that would be destroyed after he died. It was never meant for sort of public viewing. Now his staff disagreed, and they held on to it and kept it and eventually published it. And now, about 2,000 years later, it's an influential text in ethics and philosophy. So if you keep a journal near your bed, that might happen to you. So we know who Paul wrote this letter to. But why did he write these letters? Now, 1 Corinthians was written because Paul heard the community was having issues and he wanted to help. But today we're going to be focusing on the part of 2 Corinthians, which is a follow-up letter from Paul to the Corinthians after Paul's previous letter and visits. 2 Corinthians was most likely written roughly 50 to 60 CE, Common Era, AD, however you like to number your years. And that would have been about 20 to 30 years after the death of Christ. So 2 Corinthians may have been up to 4 different letters sent over a period of years that have sort of been stitched together in one big letter. And if you're interested in the historical analysis of biblical texts, come see me after. I might be able to point you towards some resources. But just FYI is kind of why some of these, if you go back and read it, it's why some of these might be a little disconnected if you try and read them. Now, there was a rift between Paul and the Corinthians. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what happened, but Paul is writing the second letter to try and mend that relationship. He still has love for the community in Corinth, and he knows that they still have love for him. Now, he is very concerned about a new group of what Paul calls super apostles that have moved into town. And it is Paul that calls them that. It's not a term I invented. It's not a term millennial or Gen Z biblical scholars are trying to make happen. Actually, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, chapter 11, verse 5, book is 2 Corinthians, I think that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. Paul's own words, translated. Now, this and any other Bible quotes I mentioned, these are going to come from the New Revised Standard Version, not King James, for reasons. And you have to imagine an eye roll, a sarcastic tone, or maybe even air quotes when Paul says, super apostles. These are people that moved into Corinth after Paul had moved on to found more Jesus communities. And these super apostles had money and were charismatic orators. You know these people. These are the consultants that are paid tons of money to say nothing in an entertaining and engaging way. So like I mentioned, I used to be a high school teacher, and each year about a week before class started, when I could have really used that time to set up my classroom and do lesson planning, we'd have to attend these professional development seminars from an educational consultant that the district had spent about the annual salary of a teacher on flying in and paying to give us this speech. And some of these people did know what they were doing, had useful things for us, as teachers and as administrators that actually helped out. Not all of them, is what we'll say. Many were using these consulting gigs in order to sell their curriculums or sell their kind of self-help for educators books and websites and such. I know I heard that the key was to build relationships with my students multiple times a year from these people, as though that were something we weren't doing already. Let's see, what else did I hear? I was taught how to find a student's learning color, personality type, learning style, learning matrix, relationship index, and a bunch more, all of varying degrees of usefulness, although far more useless than useful. And you know these people from your own life, from your own career, your own passions, hobbies, and communities. No community is safe from these people. And these super apostles, the ones you know in your life, the ones I've known in mine, and the ones that Paul was very concerned about in 2 Corinthians, were rich, charismatic, and they would take what money they could from these fledgling religious communities. And remember, Paul was poor, and he used his own money to support himself. He would work as a stonemason, make money from that, and not ask money from these religious sort of communities he was setting up. And Paul was very concerned that these super apostles would come in, take what they could until there was nothing left to take, and then the community would fall apart. So he wrote the members of his beloved community of Corinth to warn them about these people. Now, it can be complex to talk about people in situations from so long ago and from so far away. It is even more difficult when these people are held sacred in so many hearts. So while I tried to get a good modern example of super apostles, and we'll keep talking about that, I wasn't able to find a good one for Paul, which it's okay. He's a controversial, complex figure, probably the most studied writer in language that exists. So I kind of came up empty for a modern analogy for Paul. But in my sort of seminary journey, I did come up with a modern sort of analog to Jonah. That prophet from the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, he gets swallowed by a whale, travels underwater for 3 days and gets spit up in Nineveh to go spread the word of God. Jonah is the Hebrew Bible's Daffy Duck. I don't have time to go fully into that today. Maybe there's another time we can talk about just how funny the Bible and other holy texts can be sometimes, because people back then enjoyed laughing and telling funny stories just like we do today. Now, to be fair, many scholars would disagree with my interpretation here. They might say that the story of Jonah is a somber tale of duty and faith and what it means to truly trust God's word and God's plan. And honestly, the book of Jonah in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, not a very long story, pretty short. So if you have time and want to go explore that for yourself, read it, give it a read after so many years, kind of get the voice of Daffy Duck in your head, and then come back and tell me it's not Daffy Duck, and we can have that discussion. Anyway, tangent over. Jonah, Daffy Duck, it's fine. Back to Paul and the super apostles. So theologically, and this is a bit of an understatement, this next thing I'm about to say, theologically, Paul and I do not agree on much. However, if we Unitarian Universalists are going to successfully do the work to push us ever closer to that beloved community that we want to build, we're going to need to learn to work with folks that don't believe the same as us, when we can, on what we can. Don't want to be a crow or a mouse that's a little too proud to not work with the other, even though there were significant differences between those two before. And this, I think, is something that I could work on with a guy like Paul, cutting down on the influence of scammers, schemers, and hucksters in our community. And honestly, what harm is there to me if someone in this room believes differently regarding the nature of existence, of God, of gods, higher spirits, higher powers, even the nature of the soul? If one of you disagrees with me on the nature of the soul, what harm is there in this room? None. But what harm is done when the people like the super apostles take charge? Tax evasion, bankrupting our social services, the erosion of our schools and public education, the removal of abortion rights, and if we are to believe certain members of the Supreme Court and things they've said in public, the removal of certain marriage rights that we've come to enjoy for decades. My fellow humanists, let's not get too comfortable. It is not only people who believe in God that have a problem with super apostles in their community. There are many people marketing themselves out there today as rationalists or atheists or even humanists that are promoting harmful ideologies right alongside Christian nationalists and televangelists who promise that a miracle cure for your illness is just a blessing of a few $1,000s away to the mission of their church. Don't get complacent and keep an eye on who is trying to buy influence in your communities. So what can we learn from Paul here? Like specifically, not in general. How can we deal with our modern day super apostles, whether they're Christian or not? Now, Paul employs a two-point strategy against them, which can be found in 2 Corinthians chapters 11 and 12, part of which the reading was from earlier. The first angle of attack Paul uses is to take the super apostle definition of success, of being a true apostle of Jesus Christ, and he beats them at their own game. They boast of their faith in Christ and their works in his name, of their success and their wealth. Paul counters that he too is descended from Abraham. He too is Jewish. He too is from Israel, just like all of them, and that he's a better minister of Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23. Now, this is kind of similar to a tactic that some modern lawyers will use today. As an example, a defense attorney may tell the jury that everything the prosecution just said is true. Let's pretend everything the prosecution said is true, and they're exactly right. They did not describe a crime, and they did not prove that my client was guilty of it. So you have to find the defendant not guilty. I don't have to make another case. They made it for me, right? So Paul tells the Corinthians that even if everything the super apostles say is right, and they're correct, I'm still the better minister of Christ. You should still listen to me, your friend Paul, not them. And then Paul shifts to his second angle of attack, the one that I think is a little more effective. He says that the super apostle definition of success is completely wrong. They don't understand what it is to serve Christ. They just don't get it. To Paul, Christ was a servant leader. You do not follow in Christ's footsteps by becoming rich and famous and influential. You do so by being of true service to the people around you. And using this definition of success, Paul lifts up the things that make him weak as the things that make him a follower of Christ. As I mentioned earlier in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 and 10, Paul writes, Jesus said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions. Strong words from Paul. And he backs them up with actions. Say what you will about Paul and the things he writes. He believes them, and he backs them up with actions. He was oppressed by the Roman Empire at every turn. He was thrown in jail many times for his work as a follower of Christ. He was beaten and almost killed on more than one occasion. One of those occasions, he was being beaten in jail, and the only way he escaped is he jumped in a basket and got lowered down outside the walls and had to run. So he was not a what was Thomas Paine's word? A fair weather patriot, let's say. And he also made sure that he continued his work as a stonemason so as not to require money from the communities that he was trying to start and support. Paul claimed the mantle of servant leader by doing, not with fancy words, not with luxurious clothing, not by being rich, but by doing. So what happened after this letter? Well, the short answer is we don't really know. That's the limitation of studying ancient documents. Not all of them survive. Now, it's possible that this letter mended the wounds, separating Paul from his beloved Corinthians, and Paul was able to visit Corinth again. Maybe the rift had grown too large to overcome. And maybe Paul's warnings went unheeded, and the super apostles were able to take charge of the community for a time. Don't really know. But we do know what happened centuries and millennia later. Now, Paul wrote this letter as an oppressed church founder, quite literally on the run from the empire, to a community of oppressed religious minorities living under that same empire. Today, there's been a bit of a change of context in how we read these letters. I mean, sure, they've been translated a few times, but I'm not trying to accuse of some conspiracy to hide the true words of Paul. We just read them differently, different context. Paul's writings are read by members, at least here in the U.S., of the least oppressed religion in the mightiest empire the world has ever seen. That's us. That's the U.S. And those, Christianity in the U.S., I know a lot of them like to claim oppression here. I mean, in other parts of the world, sure, there are definitely Christian communities that are in pretty rough shape, but here, not so much. And there's a lot of Christians in this country and around the world that do approach Paul's writing with an eye toward that original context. We do have, it's not just UUs that are queer-affirming churches around here. There's a lot here in the U.S., even ones that are definitely part of big Christian denominations. I mean, the UUA even teamed up with the United Church of Christ, and this was years ago, to develop the OWL sex ed program, Our Whole Lives. And we all know how Paul felt about anybody having sex. But to the Christian churches who have private jets, plural, for their minister, Paul's words have been removed from that context and used as a blunt instrument for these modern super apostles to stay in power and accumulate more money. It really changes things when we take a letter written by someone crushed under an oppressive empire and transform that same letter into the basis by which a new oppressive empire rules. It's one thing when a religious leader of a small community offers his opinions on how sexual relationships should work within that community. It is quite another when the government enforces rules on sexual relationships through imprisonment and violence based on those words. So what does that mean for us, for community church here in, Plano, for Unitarian Universalism in general, for our country? Well, this church exists within a specific context, specific place, a specific time. And what I'm talking about today was specifically to you today. Now, if someone were to dig this sermon up in about 2,000 years and try to build an ethic or a religion around it, I would only say, please don't. That's not what this is for. Don't build a religion on this. Thank you in advance. But I would say that one example we can follow from Paul is that of servant leadership. Now, my home church, Westside UU, we have a relationship, and we have this for years, with a local charity called the Samaritan House. I know you all work with a lot of charities around here. Some got mentioned earlier in the service. I know God's Food Pantry is one of them. Barrett Elementary, there's some projects with them. So you scratch a stone at a UU church and you're going to find charitable works and charitable projects, right? But I know a little bit more about the Samaritan House work because, it's my home church. And the Samaritan House, just as an example, has been a fixture of Fort Worth for over 30 years, working to help people with HIV/AIDS with healthcare and housing. That puts us back into the 1990s, and as some of you that were around like me in the 1990s, not a ton of work being done in Fort Worth, Texas around the HIV/AIDS community. So they've been there for a long time, doing very good work. They are a good organization, and they're a good organization for Westside to support. Now, it's not glamorous work. There's no galas, no fancy fundraisers. There's just the work of supporting an intersection of marginalized peoples in our community. Our Samaritan Supper Club at Westside serves dinner for the people at the Samaritan House. That's all they do. It's servant leadership for the vulnerable and oppressed in our own neighborhood. There's no news cameras there when we serve the food. No self-aggrandizing social media posts to prove our righteousness. There's nothing to do but serve dinner to people in need. I guess, in other words, no super apostles need apply. Thank you all. Our benediction today is Democracy's Benediction by the Reverend Dr. Lucas Hergert. We are democracy, unruly, unfinished, unrelenting people of rebellious joy, taking to the streets, underground resilience, resisting complacence, the pleasure of activism organizing into simple hope. We are democracy, people of principles taking on principalities, witnessing the worth of those called unworthy, justice just now gaining ground, integrity of interdependent existing, extending living democracy in heads, hands, hearts. We know that democracy can die, ossify, brittle byproducts of bygone idealists, plotting politicians pirating votes, corporations cannibalizing our care for the world. Look, it can wither, distend, come to an end. Democracy, today we will love you alive, make you ours, make you thrive, and vote as though our hope is on the line.